We usually think of transportation as an essential even when it's frustrating or too expensive, but even the best commutes are usually a source of greenhouse gases. That's why some visionaries are looking more seriously at the possibility of transportation without carbon. That's the topic of a report by one of our guests, the senior policy analyst with the Frontier Group, Tony Dutzik. Also with us is an environmental and transportation advocate, the staff attorney with MassPIRG, Kirstie, Pecci. Thank you both very much for being with us.
Thank you for having us.
I want to start with Tony. First of all, about the urgency about this isn't just change because we have a better idea. This is because we really have to.
Sure. Back in December of last year, the world's leaders gathered together in Paris and agreed that it was necessary for the nations of the world to hold the rise in global temperatures under 2 degrees Celsius. And that's an important threshold because scientists tell us that beyond that level, or even at that level, that the consequences of climate change become very severe. And so in order to achieve that target, countries like the United States need to begin reducing emissions of greenhouse gases immediately, and to do it quite dramatically, to the point where by 2050 our economy has to be almost completely decarbonized. So removing carbon pollution from our transportation system is a very important piece of getting to our greenhouse gas emission reduction goals.
Kirstie, what does this do to your minds? Because often you're here as an advocate for better trains, buses, and trolleys, and they're still using up all these hydrocarbons, right?
They are still, and that's why we need to be shifting. We need to accept the fact that climate change is going to not only be very dangerous, but it's going to be very expensive as well. And so we need to balance that and look at the costs associated with shifting over to carbon neutral as soon as quick as we can. In the interim, at least reduced carbon. And many parts of the state are already doing that. PVTA just ordered 2 electric buses. So we're going to be able to do this, especially if we follow some of the recommendations that Tony's made in the report.
Tony, do these vehicles really generate that much? Because we hear about other sources, whether it's factories or even homes.
Sure. Well, in America, transportation accounts for a little over a quarter of our greenhouse gas emissions. And Americans, our transportation sector actually produces more carbon dioxide every year than the entire economy of any other country in the world besides China, Russia, and India. So on the global scale, our transportation system produces about 4% of the world's greenhouse gases, which is a significant amount. And if we're going to achieve our emission reduction goals as a country, we have to address transportation.
Kirstie, what about some of the new tools? You've looked at this report. Anything strike you as particularly promising?
Well, I'm very excited, as I said already, about the electric buses and different ways of doing things better that we're already doing. I'm very excited about doing things in an entirely different way too, which some of the new tools are letting us do. Right now in Massachusetts, GATRA, the Greater Attleboro Taunton Transit Authority, has started a pilot program where they're pooling all the different ways to get around on a website, so that you can say, I want to get from here to there and look it up in one place. If we can do that so that we're much more efficient about our movement, and if we can then try and avoid single occupancy vehicles entirely, that will make a big difference in becoming carbon neutral in the long term. We have to start moving towards that. Also, as Tony said, by 2050 is not that far away. There are a lot of technologies that are going to be entirely new by that time, though, that are already in play. Autonomous vehicles are one of them. That hopefully, if we can transition to an electric fleet that isn't owned by individuals but is owned cooperatively, so that you call when you need a car, you don't have a parked car in your garage anymore, we can lessen the number of cars. If they're electric, maybe they'd be powered by solar. There's a lot of stuff it's very real. It's coming very soon. So we need to make those policy decisions to get there.
Tony, what about electric cars? I mean, I've mostly heard that, yes, they're better than they used to be, maybe not as expensive as they used to be, but they're still relatively expensive, aren't they?
Well, I think of electric vehicles that are on the market today, there's still, the upfront cost is still higher than a gasoline-powered car. But over the course of a vehicle's lifetime, the amount that you save both by driving electric vehicles are just inherently much more efficient than gasoline-powered cars. And so the amount of money that you save over the course of a vehicle's lifetime, certainly in fuel costs and to some extent in maintenance, can pay back that initial investment. But even there, The upfront costs of electric vehicles and electric vehicle batteries, which has been the big sticking point, have been coming down dramatically, multiple percentage points per year, to the point where it's possible for us to envision in a few years electric vehicles that are competitive in terms of upfront costs. And at the same time that they're getting cheaper, they're also getting better. So you just recently had the announcement of the new Tesla vehicle, which is going to be, I believe, fairly competitive cost-wise in terms of its initial cost, and is going to have a 200-mile range, so that you can drive your vehicle, do everything that you need to do in the course of a day, and make sure that you're going to have enough charge to get back. So there have already been more than 250,000 pre-orders placed for that car. So there's definitely an appetite out there for clean transportation that's cost-effective and that works for people's lifestyles.
Kirstie, you mentioned the possibility of access to cars without actually owning one and having to park it in a parking space. But how do you get to the restructure of the way we live to make that possible?
Well, I think that has already begun. People are, especially millennials, are much more hooked into their phones than they are to their vehicles, and we've talked about this in the past. And so if that continues, and you're able to access whatever transportation you need, when I leave here, I'm going to take an Uber to South Station and then take the train home. If you're able to do that, then you're driving those costs down and changing how we do things and where we put our money day to day. And I think that's already happening. I think we just need to make sure that we create avenues and policies that regulate that in a smart way, and that we incentivize good decisions, carbon neutral decisions, rather than decisions that we could end up having even more cars on the road if we don't put good policies in place.
Tony, what about the difference between Uber and Lyft and taxi cabs? I mean, aren't Uber and Lyft just phone-centric taxi cabs, or is there something more to it than that?
Well, I think that they provide a lot of the functions that taxis do. So if you're looking for on-demand transportation, it used to be that you would call a taxi, or you would hail one on the street. And now you can hail a taxi or a Lyft or an Uber on your smartphone. I think one of the things that has happened with Lyft and Uber in some parts of the country, and I think this is true of Greater Boston, is that it's enabled people who live in areas where taxis used to be really hard to get to have access to on-demand transportation. So, if you were in the suburbs of Boston, it was oftentimes, very difficult for you to find a taxi that was both affordable and that would come and get you at a time when it was convenient to you relatively quickly. Now with Lyft and Uber and other services like it, it becomes possible for people to have access to on-demand transportation, and that changes how people live their lives and the decisions that they make. And, I think, to echo what Kirstie just said, the hope would be, and I think there's still a lot of research and experience that needs to be had to see the extent to which this is happening, because we tend to forget that many of these services are really very new. I mean, Uber and Lyft have been around for maybe 5 years in total. And so we still need to be building up our experience of how these things work and how they change our lives. But the ultimate hope would be that if you have access to on-demand mobility when you need it, if you have access to transit, if you have access to shared vehicles and have good access to being able to walk and bike places that you need to go, that more and more people will choose to avoid the very costly upfront investment in a car. And when you do that, a lot of things change. Our communities change, you start to have less congestion, less competition for parking, and many households save money by doing it as well.
Kirstie, I wonder about transportation equity here, because some of these innovations, my first instinct is always, well, that's going to be for people who have a little more money and a little more, prompting in how to use these devices. But can we still have equity and still have better results as far as climate change?
Well, we don't have equity now. And that's something that we really need to remember when we're looking at this. And that is another reason why we need to put good policies in place. The system in place now, whether you're talking about single occupancy vehicles or transit or bike paths and walking paths, folks who are struggling don't have as much access to those things now. They don't. And so we need to find ways to hook people into the system and support them. I think that demand management is one of the ways to assist in that, because the flexibility that Tony's talking about is less expensive for households. So that's one thing that we need to keep working on. But we also need to take the thinkers in transportation, the people who are working very hard, like Tony, to come up with great ideas and great policies and ways of changing the world, and make sure that we're getting input from social justice communities who are struggling, so that they're represented and at the table as well, and they can help us to make sure that the policies we adopt are equitable, as you're saying.
Tony, another thing here is that you want to have transportation that can accommodate population growth and economic growth. So how important is this carbon-free model for that?
Well, I think it's increasingly important because if you look at a city like Boston, we're not going to be growing our highways appreciably. I mean, we're not going to redig the big dig to add lanes going through downtown Boston. And so if we're going to accommodate more people, if we're going to accommodate more jobs and economic opportunity, we're going to have to do that in ways that reduce our dependence on single passenger cars and reduce our dependence on cars overall. And there's reason to believe that we certainly can do that with public transportation, with promoting walking and biking. But also some of these new tools give us opportunities to start thinking about ways that we can, by sharing cars, reduce the number of cars that we have in our communities. I mean, if you think about all of the neighborhoods of Boston, which, like my street, are wide enough for 3 cars, and 2/3 of that area is occupied by cars that are sitting still most of the day, you quickly begin to get an idea of what the potential changes might be, what the potential benefits for some of our neighborhoods might be if we can move from a model where everyone feels the need, and many people really do feel the need and have the need to own a car in our current system. If we can think forward and begin to move toward a system where people have the flexibility not to own a car, that has a lot of potential benefits and improvements for our neighborhoods in the long term.
Thank you both very much. Tony Dutzik from the Frontier Group and Kirstie Pecci from MassPIRG.